Yes. He's on his way. Just got an email from him. Exciting stuff. Can you just introduce yourself?
My name is Omar Granados. I'm a professor of Latin American Studies at UW La Crosse.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. Okay, so first, can you explain what the Mariel Boatlift is in your own terms?
So in 1980, by the end of the 1970s in Cuba, there's a lot of discontent with political and economic measures of the Fidel Castro government. People were seeking ways to leave the island. One of those ways was breaking into embassies with the intention of finding political, status, refugee status in a different country. And the first group of people that started the started of the Mariel Boatlift broke on April of 1980. They broke into the Peruvian embassy in Havana, and the response from the Cuban government to that event, which was a very violent event. One of the guards died in the break-in. They basically drove a bus into the embassy. Was to escalate things internationally. They blamed the embargo, the United States embargo. Jimmy Carter was president in 1980, and he, in response, offered to take in some of the people that had been kept at the embassy, which by 48 hours later, after the break-in, there were 10,000 people in there, because Castro had said, whoever wants to go, we'll let him go. So this obviously became an international news piece, and United Nations, the Refugee Committee was involved, and just escalated the tensions that already existed between Cuba and the United States during the Cold War, what is known as the Cold War, which I'm pretty sure you've been studying. So then, a few weeks later, I think they announced that families in the South Florida community, Cuban American community, could sail to Cuba and pick up their relatives. So this became immediately a major boat lift. About 1,200 different boats and sailboats and motorboats came down. And people were renting this and boats from New Orleans, shrimp boats, and just with the purpose of bringing those boats to the Mariel port, which was the port designated for this, and bringing their relatives. In the meantime, the Cuban government had announced this publicly, and they were allowing people to self-declare or turn themselves in as social scum, basically. In Spanish, the word is escoria, which is a white term for homosexuals, mental patients, criminals, given the fact that during the 70s, the concept of criminality in Cuba was very flexible. Anybody who would have long hair like we do would be considered, a social lumpen, and, listening to the Beatles, smoking marijuana, or just not having a job, or resisting to go into mandatory military service, which for young men like yourself was 3 years. That would be considered a criminal act against the revolution. So you would be considered a social enemy of the revolution, and therefore brought into juvenile detention. Or so a lot of the people that were convinced or pushed out of the country were people that were actually in jails under this law of criminality, which was enacted in 1971, which said basically the police could make arrests based on looks. So you would just be standing on the corner of your house, and your hair, you probably like the Beatles and you speak English, huh? Come with us. Or you've been smoking marijuana or whatever the cops would think. And then that would be the end of it. And so a lot of those people were encouraged to join the Mariel Boatlift. Others were just sent to the port of Mariel, intellectuals that didn't agree with the government, homosexuals and others in the LGBT community, and families, So during the arrival of those boats, people would have to pick up their relatives and a number of other people that they didn't know on their boat. So you go down, get your cousin and 6 other people that the government would force you to take back to the United States. About 84% of that population was black. They were young men between the ages of 18 and 26, and they didn't have family in the United States. So once they arrived in Key West, those who had family were, easily relocated in the South Florida community. Those who didn't have family were sent to military bases as under the temporary immigration status of entrant with parole status. I forget the original, the exact term. But they lived in places like Fort McCoy. Another one was in Fort Chaffee in Arkansas. There was another bigger base in Florida, in South Florida.
And there was one in Indiana too, correct?
In Pennsylvania.
Oh,
yeah.
That's right.
So, those people were landed in places like Sparta, Wisconsin, where the population wasn't really used to Spanish or a large black presence, and they struggled to get resettled into those communities. But that's the story of resettlement. So that's basically how I define the Mariel Boatlift.
Awesome. Let's see. I saw a term. They called all the boats the flotilla. Why was that called the flotilla?
I think it's a technical term for a number of small embarkations or boats, or it doesn't have any political meaning. I think it's just a technical term. The word in Spanish is a fleet, is flota. So maybe they just use the term flotilla, which is a small fleet. But to be honest, I'm not 100% sure. I know there's no political connotation to it.
Yeah. Let's see. What was the trip across the Florida Straits like on the boats?
Dangerous, problematic, and there's some stories about that in the podcast. I think in episode 1, if you want to go back and listen to those. But basically, these were people who were not experienced sailors, who were renting these boats and speedboats and whatever they could find to then come back with overcrowded, under whatever sea conditions they were allowed to leave. So many people died in the sea, and I don't think the stress or the anxiety of not knowing where you were going to go or how you were going to end up helped also.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it was the descriptions I have heard from the witnesses that we have here in La Crosse, that they're this dangerous trip. It's not something that they remember as a non-traumatic event.
Yeah. What was life like in Fort McCoy for the immigrants?
Very good question. It was. There were different things happening at Fort McCoy. The main thing was the uncertainty of what was going to happen to you. For some people, it was, if you had been in jail in Cuba, sentenced to 40 years in prison for punching a police officer during a fight, resisting arrest. That was the case of one of our interviewees. For those people like him, was a great situation. He was again able to play sports,
He was
read the news, he was helping in the kitchen, he was learning English and practicing, making friends. There was a lot of friendships that were created between Army personnel and refugees. There were separations between the barracks. They slept in World War II barracks that were not heated. And this was already the summer, but it went into the middle of September. Families were separated from males and females. So there was a whole other life. I'd like to describe it as the continuation of an interrupted Cuban life. These were people who came to the United States with dreams of freedom and hope, and they had imagined having a big house and a big car, and being a millionaire with a swimming pool and the pictures that they had seen or the movies that they had. And instead they ended up in a refugee camp, much like a prison. But then within that environment, there were micro worlds that created, like there was a black market there. There were people that were making art and writing. There was a newspaper that was produced by the Army in collaboration with the refugees, which is a really interesting document if you have time to take a look at El Mercurio in McCoy. And that's what tells you really what was happening in the camp. And it circulated eternally only, but today we're able to look at it and learn, what they were doing day by day. And there was also a lot of violence in the camp because a lot of the problems that had existed between neighborhoods, gangs in Cuba or in Cuban jails were brought over to the camp. So, if you had an enemy in a Cuban jail, all of a sudden he was in your same, barrack. So that would have, and there was instances of sexual violence and extortion. And a lot of the problems there were because the federal government relied on Cuban forces to self-police the camp, and obviously that led to corruption, and that led to abuse in many cases. So there was a little bit of everything. I would say the biggest thing was the anxiety of life, in a refugee camp, and not having a immigrant identity, not knowing what the future was holding.
In your first episode, you talked to Enrique, and his story is pretty cool. He plays a lot of music, and as a musician myself, I was just wondering what Enrique was like.
I actually, my colleague was the one who interviewed Enrique, Maureen McCollum, So I actually never met Enrique. I was more involved with the rest of the other 5 people that, but Enrique is kind of a lone wolf in the Cuban Mariel community, and that's probably why I haven't gotten to know him very much. But I know he's a musician, and as you can hear in his voice, he's full of positive energy and a happy person who has, like they all have reinvented themselves. Even in their late 60s, they're still working and playing music and trying to engage with their communities in many ways. So.
Is there a meaning behind the term Marielitos?
Yes. It comes from the word Mariel, which is the name of the port. It was a term created by the Cuban American community. It's a condescending term, it's diminishing in many ways, and what it does is it separates this group socially and economically and culturally from the previously existing Cuban American community of South Florida. So those people who would come with lots of money in the 1960s had established themselves as a predominantly white immigrant community who in South Florida who had the resources to educate their children in good colleges. They built a lot of the infrastructure that there is in Miami today. So for them, the fact that 84% of Mariel refugees were black wasn't good news.
Yeah.
And the stigma of the criminal subject also had an influence. So they started using the term Marielitos as a way of separating themselves. I'm not a Marielito. Marielito is that person who came in a boat. So a lot of the Mariel community actually, a lot of their effort has been focused on precisely clearing up their name, as particularly in Miami, where that name is very prevalent. We're not all criminals. We're not, we also are good citizens who want to contribute, and artists and intellectuals. So there were several meanings attached to that word. Homosexuality was one of them. In the 1980s, that was a whole different, concept to manage than it is today. So that is the origin and how it was mostly used. I think nowadays the term has regained some of its social power, and it's to call yourself a Marielito is actually they've recaptured the meaning of the word for their own use, and it's a badge of honor, more than anything. But I'm sure you're familiar with the film Scarface.
Yes.
So that film, it has the record for the most times the F word has been used in a movie in Hollywood. Yes, 286. And the Tony Montana is Marielito in the film. So that film was made in 1983, 2 years after Mariel refugees had just started building their lives in Miami and elsewhere. Imagine going to the movies and seeing Tony Montana with a scar on his face saying, I'm the king of Miami, I'm the drug pimp lord, So it didn't help the Mariel community, there's a scene, a very famous scene in the film where he's being interrogated by immigration officers, and he says, I'm a Marielito, I'm a political refugee, I played for my classes at UWL, and people always like that scene. So that's sort of how that work got started in Miami, and now it's more of a like I said, more of like a badge of honor that community is proud to say, yeah, I came in Mariel.
I was researching this murder in Toma. How did that affect the other good immigrants in the area?
The press was the main element there. To this day, no one really knows what happened that day. There's no concrete evidence.
It took a lot of digging to just even find a little bit.
Right. So, and that person, Lene Cepes, he still claims his innocence. But there was a big social stigma against Cubans in this area, in Toma, Sparta, La Crosse. A lot of complaints about Cubans who, at the time, didn't really understand the law of the United States. And just to mention a few examples of things that would get them in trouble, driving without a license, crossing into trespassing into postal land, carrying a knife in their pocket, things like that they probably were used to in Cuba. Dating a minor was another big one, which many of them have charges for that to this day. The legally appropriate age for a person to start dating in Cuba was 16, to have, which is lower than in the United States. So that confused many of them also. And there was also criminal activity, particularly involvement with drugs in the 1980s in bigger cities like Madison. But the sensational aspect that this provided for local press like the La Crosse Tribune, even since the moment that they were at Fort McCoy, they kept focusing on the violence, the raping, so that kind of translated out to the world and at the national level also. The New York Times
focused on the bad things.
Yeah, the New York Times was also publishing, images of black men rioting at Fort Chaffee. There were, the La Crosse Tribune had probably 60 articles that were talking about sexual deviancy and criminality and the cost of this exodus to American taxpayers. And this is happening during the election time when Carter is trying to get reelected. So the press really had an impact on how the public saw Mariel refugees, and not to deny that there were cases of criminality that were real, but it wasn't the majority of. And that they had brought that stigma from Cuba as well. Castro dumped our criminals, dumped the criminals on us, Scarface, and there were some cases like Lenny's case and a couple other ones where I think it's episode 6 of the podcast that really details. There's a story of a man who tried to kill Jeffrey Dahmer while he was in prison in Wisconsin. That story is pretty interesting. Is the man who, one of the men who came in Mariel who tried to take venganza on Jeffrey Dahmer, because he wanted to be famous and with Oprah, and maybe that get him some money. to go back to Cuba, and pretty interesting story.
Yeah. I'll have to put that in there.
Yeah.
One last question. How has the boat lift affected culture in the surrounding areas of Fort McCoy? Like restaurants, just people seeing Cubans in general. How has that affected?
At the time, it was a big shock. It was, there was a little bit of both. There was that stigma that we just talked about, but there was also a lot of solidarity between families who sponsored Cubans, who are still in touch with them. Every time we have an event, people come out and they re-encounter, one of our volunteers, and do you remember me? I worked at the kitchen, So that's the beauty of it. But at that time, I think the general sentiment was rejection and discrimination. It wasn't an easy time for these Cuban folk. I think at the personal level, these friendships that were created between soldiers and kitchen people and volunteers, interpreters who worked at Fort McCoy, those were very strong and positive. But once they got out of the fort, and in places like Sparta and Toma, small places that mostly all Cubans came to La Crosse or continued to Madison or Chicago or bigger cities, or they just went to Miami or New Jersey, which is another Cuban settlement in the United States. But so I don't think there is a big impact that we can see today. Like there isn't a Cuban restaurant that you can go to, or anything that visible. Perhaps in La Crosse, there's about 30 or 35 of those men that are still here. Some have families. Austin, Minnesota is another place where they settle because of the meat packing industry there. But to answer your question, I don't think there's a lot of history that we can see. It's not Miami where you're just walking around and you're seeing Cuban stuff all over the place.
Was there anything else you think I should know about?
One of the main things that we tried to do with this project was to give visibility to this community, and it's because of the conditions that these folks are living in terms of their immigration status. Some of them, because they had criminal records, offenses, federal offenses back in the day, mostly drug related, they are unable to apply for citizenship or permanent resident status. So what that means is that they, can have access to specific services. They can, they have to apply and reapply for a work permit every 2 years. So it's a hard life, after 45 years of paying taxes and living as an American. And the most important thing is that many of them are unable to travel back to Cuba because of this situation. They're kind of in immigration limbo. They can't leave the United States, but they also don't belong.
You can't go back to Cuba.
Right, or they also are not citizens of the United States. So it's a never-ending floating parole status that they have, and they're starting to die. A couple of the people that are in the podcast passed away already this year. So I don't think we've advocated. I don't think there's anything, particularly not in the current political climate. I don't think there's anything that we can do to help them. But I guess just tell the story and from the perspective of those folks
Yeah.
rather than the national media or the story that is written by the U.S. government, which is what you're doing. So good for you.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for meeting with me.
Absolutely, I'm glad that we have a historian in the making.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely, yeah. How long?
I am here with my mother. Say hi, Mom. We're at the Commemorative Center here in Fort McCoy, and we will be looking at some documents. Just gotta get the key in. Alright. We're in. Let's turn these lights on. Yep. So right over here we have the display. We have some weapons that were made by the refugees. The operation was run by PSYOPs, so there's articles about that.
This is the newspaper he was telling you about?
Yes. This is a newspaper that was done by Cubans in, what's the word? Whatever the word is, with Fort McCoy. Now we're gonna head back here and look at some documents. This is my mom's lovely office.
Remember which one you were in?
Yeah. And these are all the documents on the refugees. Other side. Let's get to work. I am here inside the commemorative area, and I am very lucky my mom works here because I have gained access to the upstairs. If you ever want to see some cool, oh, just a string. Scared me. Now it may go dark here, but it'll be just for a minute. The refugees would have slept in here on the same beds that the soldiers would sleep in. So this is an example because this is the only barrack I have access to that has beds. So this is where they would have slept. There was no bathroom in here except for downstairs, so they had to go downstairs. Sorry. And then certain people would get these special rooms. And there was no heating in these buildings back in the day. Yeah. Good evening. It is currently 10 p.m. I am here to share some facts and photos. So, bam, photo, 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 and photo. I was allowed by the US government to bring this book. In it is all the files on the Boatlift. Talks about wounds. It talks about how many people came in. It talks about what they ate. And I'll be bringing this in tomorrow, so it's pretty awesome. It even shows Fort Chaffee, Fort McCoy, all those things. Hello again. Check out the website. All the photos are on there. And facts.